The Heroes of Olympus series is the second pentalogy in the Camp Half-Blood Chronicles by author Rick Riordan. The sequel series to Percy Jackson and the Olympians, it features most of the characters from that series along with introducing new characters. The biggest difference structurally between the two series is that the writing voice shifted from single perspective first person to multi-perspective third person. Where the original pentalogy had been told exclusively from Percy Jackson's point of view, this series had several different narrators, each with their own set of perspectives, opinions, and experiences. And if that change wasn't jarring enough for fans, the three narrators of the first book in the series, The Lost Hero, are all newly introduced characters, and our beloved Percy doesn't make a single appearance. The book begins with the narration of Jason, a character who we the fanbase have never heard of, and who has lost all of his memories, meaning he's also never heard of himself. This makes it difficult to get into this book as a fan. I don't know about you, but when I first read it, I really struggled with it. I think the decision to write the book in this way may have contributed to the general apathy/dislike of Jason as a character, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Because while the other male point of view character, Leo, is beloved by the fandom, the third one, Piper, is by all accounts the most disliked protagonist in the entire Camp Half-Blood Chronicles. Having read all of the Heroes of Olympus books many times, I never had a problem with Piper, and I remember relating to her in a lot of ways when I first read The Lost Hero. But upon checking the groups and the forums, I found that there were very divisive opinions about Piper McLean, with the anti-Piper side being very loud and proud. So in light of all of the vitriol for this character, I thought it might be good to really look into the complaints against her. And despite my admitted bias in favor of this character, I've tried to make an effort to see where the naysayers are coming from based on the text of the books. That said, I hope to demonstrate with evidence from the text that perhaps this hatred for Piper may not be justified. But before I do that, some caveats. There are some Cherokee readers that have issues with the way Piper is written. Rick Riordan is a white author, so his depiction of Indigenous characters is obviously not from an Indigenous perspective. Some feel that writing a Cherokee character that grew up in extreme wealth and never really lived on a reservation was kind of a cop-out on Rick's part, but the thing about that is that I am really not the best person to make a video on that topic because I don't know anything about it whatsoever and I'm not Cherokee, so I'm not going to delve into that topic. This is really just about the common criticisms of Piper within the fandom, based on the text of the books themselves and whether or not those criticisms have merit or could be considered fair. Also, this is your spoiler warning. This is going to contain spoilers for Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Heroes of Olympus. I won't talk about Trials of Apollo though, because most people haven't read those yet, and most of these complaints predate that series. So with that out of the way, let's dive in. If you Google this question, the first answer that appears is this post on Quora, to which several users responded with answers that mirror a lot of things I've seen on fan websites, groups, and forums. Some of the responses overlap, so I'll group them up and then just explain each one in depth in the next section. Otherwise, we'd have a list of 15 rather than 6, and I don't have time for that. The complaints are as follows. 1. Her privileged life and lack of contentment with it. 2. Her mother. 3. She thinks she's not like other girls. 4. She's too obsessed with her boyfriend. 5. She's not attracted to Percy. And 6. She doesn't deserve to be considered so powerful. Now, some more observant among you may already have noticed this, but some of these reasons are pretty misogynistic or just kind of dumb. And this fact has not escaped the fandom. If you bring this up, usually what happens is that people acknowledge that some of these are definitely sexist and silly, but others, particularly the idea that she's too obsessed with her boyfriend, are totally valid. So I agree that if a teenage girl is written to be constantly thinking about her boyfriend and only her boyfriend, that would be a very one-dimensional and uninteresting character. But having read through every book in the series multiple times, including once again just for this, I honestly don't think it's fair to say that Piper only thinks or cares about Jason. I think there's a dubious bias going on here, prompting people to focus on the portions of the story that support their perspective and ignore all of the evidence that contradicts it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's dive into these. In order to answer whether or not these complaints are justified, we have to explain the reasoning behind every criticism one at a time, and then discuss whether they have any merit within the text. So let's go down the list. Number 1. Piper's privileged life and her lack of contentment. In addition to being the first female point of view character in the franchise, Piper is also the first character to come from a highly affluent background. Her father is A-list Hollywood actor and Cherokee man Tristan McLean from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Like many Native people, he wanted to escape the social and economic depression that reservations suffer from. While in Oklahoma, he met and had a relationship with the goddess Aphrodite, although she never revealed her true identity to him. Some point after she had given birth to Piper, Aphrodite disappeared from the home she shared with Tristan and never returned, leaving Tristan devastated. When Piper was 5, she and her father moved from Oklahoma to California as Tristan's success as an actor began to take off. From then on, Piper lived a materially privileged life and was educated at various expensive schools, but rarely spent any time with Tristan. Piper was cared for mainly by personal assistants, drivers, and chefs rather than her father. She always asked for PB&J. PB&J was simple food, like a regular kid would have for lunch. Sometimes she pretended her dad had actually made it for her, not a personal chef from France. Couldn't anything be simple? That's why she turned down the fancy clothes Dad always offered, the designer shoes, the trips to the salon, and she hated the snobby private schools Dad thought were good for her. She kept getting herself kicked out. He kept finding more schools. Dad, just listen for once. I want to go to regular school. I want you to take me to parents' night, not your personal assistant. Or homeschool me. I learned so much when we read about Greece together. We could do that all the time. Don't make this about me, her dad said. I do the best I can, Piper. We've had this conversation. No, she thought. You've cut off this conversation. For years. When they did spend time together, it was tightly scheduled and would end early if anything came up. Tristan would not give her any real information about her mother and didn't like to talk about his life on the reservation, feeling embarrassment over his heritage rather than pride. Because of this, Piper feels disconnected from her culture, except through certain myths that her father would sometimes tell her as a small child. Piper wished she remembered her grandpa better. Sometimes she dreamed about that little 2-room house in Oklahoma. She wondered what it would have been like to grow up there. Her dad would think that was nuts. He had spent his whole life running away from that place, distancing himself from the res, playing any role except Native American. He'd always told Piper how lucky she was to grow up rich and well cared for. She'd learned to be vaguely uncomfortable about her ancestry, like Dad's old pictures from the 80s, when he had feathered hair and crazy clothes. Can you believe I ever looked like that? He'd say. Being Cherokee was the same for him, something funny and mildly embarrassing. In an attempt to get his attention and force him to take a personal role in her life, she eventually turns to pulling stunts and committing crimes in order to get caught and punished by him. I steal stuff, she said. My dad never had any time for me unless I got in trouble. Now, most of the other demigod protagonists have histories of abuse and trauma, or had parents with toxic tendencies or addictions. They have pasts that anyone would find objectively horrifying. So as a reader, you have an easy time sympathizing with them and responding emotionally to their problems, because the chances are that these traumas are similar to or worse than the ones that we may have experienced. And because of this, I think that some people have a hard time feeling bad about a rich girl's problems, because she has privileges that most of us don't. Sure, she's bullied at school and emotionally neglected by her father, but she lives in a literal mansion and goes to really good schools and wants for nothing. So why should we feel bad for her? The problem I have with this argument is that it ignores the very real harm done to emotionally neglected children. These children have an increased risk of having mental health problems, especially anxiety and depression. They're more likely to have self-esteem and mental problems as adults, and are considered high risk to commit crimes. Tristan doesn't allow Piper any real connection to her culture by refusing to talk about his past. Nor does he care about the fact that these expensive special schools he sends her to are not where she wants to be, largely because of the intense bullying she endures there from spoiled, shallow rich kids who mock her for not looking and dressing exactly like them. There's also a tendency to falsely equate Tristan devoting all of his time to work to a working class parent spending all of their time working to make ends meet. It's very clear from the lifestyle they lead that Tristan is choosing not to make time for Piper and avoids explaining why. He eventually explains to her that he feels she's better off without him and Hollywood in her life, but not until she's nearly 16 and has already shut down any discussion about her emotional needs for years. There's no reason he couldn't take time off to spend with his kid, as many A-listers do, but she's lucky to get a couple of hours with him a few times a year. I can't believe I need to state this, but apparently it's needed. Wanting a relationship with your father is not the desire of an entitled, spoiled brat. That's a really basic desire for most children, especially when you've only got one parent. I have a suspicion that this criticism is really an unwillingness to accept the fact that rich and famous people have problems. I think a lot of people really believe that if they were rich and famous, they'd have no complaints. But I have a pretty founded suspicion that isn't true, because occasionally celebrities do talk about the fact that being famous is terrible and can take a serious toll on your mental health. The whole world is constantly watching you for any mistake with gleeful readiness to take you down, and at some point they stop viewing you as a person. You cease to be your own person and exist purely for the entertainment of the public, who feel ownership over you and entitled to criticize you and demand things from you. But these are problems that most readers do not experience and never will. So when Piper complains about them, people feel like she's whiny and ungrateful, which is ironically the same response a lot of famous people get when they talk about this. So if you've, for example, grown up in an abusive household or in poverty, then you might feel apathetic or resentful of Piper because you feel like she doesn't have real problems. But really, they're just problems you don't relate to. This is an empathy block, and these happen in the real world all the time. It happens whenever someone else is being crushed by a problem that another person doesn't understand. If you've ever cried to a parent about a problem only for them to tell you that your problems are silly and don't matter, then you've experienced this yourself, and you know it's unfair. Not being able to understand someone's problems doesn't make them less important or the distress less real. Not being able to relate to somebody's problems doesn't make them unimportant. And it's perfectly okay to not relate to Piper's problems. But she is not a whiny, ungrateful brat just because she values her relationship with her dad and a connection to her culture over her material wealth. And yet, for some reason, a lot of people interpret her this way. Number 2, Piper's mother. So to explain this criticism, I think we first have to acknowledge that while I do love them, the Percy Jackson and the Olympians books have some problems. And I don't just mean the plot holes and typos, of which there are many, so many. The fact is that in an effort to avoid having to flesh out every single kid in camp, Uncle Rick resorted to stereotypes and generalizations when describing the children of the gods. We were lucky to get one named character from any cabin, and even then we'd probably learn nothing meaningful about that character. On top of this, our entire perspective was filtered through Percy's eyes, a perspective that is not always reliable and is always subjective. The children of Aphrodite have been barely mentioned, and when they have, it's not been flattering. They're always painted as a monolith with shallow personalities and trivialized interests, and no fighting abilities. "You have a strong will," Aphrodite mused. "I'm never given much credit among the gods. My children are laughed at. They're dismissed as conceited and shallow." "Some of them are," Aphrodite laughed. "Granted. Perhaps I'm conceited and shallow too sometimes." The only exception to that rule would be Selena, but she was fairly devoid of any character development or backstory until the last Olympian, in which she dies. Annabeth explains to Percy in The Lightning Thief that lots of demigods are very famous historical figures, and that they influence history in many different ways beyond their fighting abilities. A few manage to survive in the outside world and become famous. Believe me, if I told you the names, you'd know them. Throughout the franchise, we learn that some demigods have become politicians, artists, actors, musicians, activists, athletes, and more. So it's definitely not the case that combat skills are the only thing that makes a demigod powerful or important. Regardless of Percy's fighting skills, the success of his quests always depends on cleverness, strategy, and quick thinking, because he's still no match for most of the godly and primordial beings in this universe. Skill in combat is at best one of the skills that are important for demigods to develop, and it isn't even the most important one. Even in the mythology, Orpheus charmed some of the most powerful beings in the universe using his music and poetry. He was not a fighter. But regardless of all of this, combat skills are very highly regarded within the fandom, because Percy likes to sword fight, and we've lived in his head for 5 books. So the children of Aphrodite are not respected or taken seriously. They tend to actively avoid violent situations, dislike the camp activities that Percy enjoys, and prefer to focus on things he considers trivial, like makeup. And all of that is perfectly valid characterization for Percy, but his word is not law. I think that this veneration of combat skills is kind of schist, and it's ignoring the many non-combative characters with valuable roles to play in the story. Will Solace comes to mind, a son of Apollo who is one of the camp's best healers, and the satyrs who recruit and protect demigods. There are also lots of non-combative ways for demigods to make a difference in a combat situation. Musical enchantments, woodland magic, and charm speak come to mind. So there's no reason to assume that all of Aphrodite's children are useless, especially since they participated in the Battle of Manhattan with Percy, while the combative children of Ares sat most of it out. It doesn't help her image that the few appearances of Aphrodite in the series prior to Piper's introduction depict her as very self-interested. She's not concerned with the major conflicts happening in the story and cares very little for how her actions affect anyone else. In her only conversation with Percy, she actively defends causing the Trojan War and shows apathy for all of the deaths she caused. Love conquers all, Aphrodite promised. Look at Helen and Paris. Did they let anything come between them? Didn't they start the Trojan War and get thousands of people killed? That's not the point. So the general dislike towards Aphrodite is likely playing a part in the dislike for Piper. She's tainted by association. But the thing about that is Piper herself feels ambivalent about her mother. Over the course of her storyline in Book 1, she comes to understand that she gets to define what being a child of the love goddess means, and that maybe Aphrodite isn't as bad as everyone says. Aphrodite is about love and beauty, being loving, spreading beauty, good friends, good times, good deeds, not just looking good. I'm going to set things right, and I've got a feeling Mom will be on my side. Rather than falling into the trap of seeing Aphrodite in a stereotypical way, she redefines what love as a domain could actually mean, the net good it could be, and the power it could bring. She realizes that she's allowed to be her own person, regardless of who her mother is and how people feel about it. And that neatly brings us into complaint number 3. She thinks she's not like other girls. So this one is rooted in the fact that Piper eschews traditionally feminine interests. Her personal discomfort with makeup and feminine attire is often used as evidence that Piper looks down on femininity. When she first arrives at Camp Half-Blood in The Lost Hero, one of the first people she sees is Drew Tanaka, the head counselor of the Aphrodite cabin at this point in the story, and instantly dislikes her. Another girl stepped forward. Tall, Asian, dark hair and ringlets, plenty of jewelry and perfect makeup. Somehow she managed to make jeans and an orange t-shirt look glamorous. She glanced at Leo, fixed her eyes on Jason like he might be worthy of her attention, and then curled her lip at Piper as if she were a week-old burrito that had just been pulled out of a dumpster. Piper knew this girl's type. She'd dealt with a lot of girls like this at the Wilderness School, and every other stupid school her father had sent her to. Piper knew instantly that they were going to be enemies. Drew then makes some derogatory remarks about the newcomers, and Piper tries to defend herself and her friends. "Hey," Piper said. "We didn't ask to be brought here." Drew sniffed. "And nobody wants you here, hun. Does your hair always look like a dead badger?" Then, when Annabeth is giving her a tour of the camp, Piper takes note of the Aphrodite cabin, and it doesn't exactly appeal to her sensibilities. They pass the next cabin, number 10, which was decorated like a Barbie house, with lace curtains, a pink door, and potted carnations in the windows. They walked up by the doorway, and the smell of perfume almost made Piper gag. "Gah! Is this where supermodels go to die?" Annabeth smirked. "Aphrodite's cabin, goddess of love. Drew is head counselor." "Figures," Piper grumbled. A lot of people read this as Piper looking down on Drew and the other Aphrodite kids because they're interested in stereotypically feminine things. This is so ubiquitous that if you go to the fan wiki page about Piper and scroll down to the personality section, it says, "She tended to reject and insult femininity and those who wear feminine clothes before knowing them, insulting the Aphrodite cabin for the pink lace and strong scent of perfume, thinking all Aphrodite kids and their mother were weak and shallow before getting to know them, insulting anything remotely feminine." But I don't think the text really supports that. For one thing, it wasn't the fact that Drew wore makeup and had curled hair that made Piper feel they wouldn't get along. Piper only got bad vibes from Drew after she noticed Drew giving her the stink eye and a sour face. And then Drew said something really rude about her, and about her appearance specifically, to her face. Drew then forces all of the other Aphrodite kids to bully Piper, going so far as to actively punish the only person who is even remotely kind to her. The sense I get from this is that Piper hates Drew because she's a bully, judging Piper solely on her appearance, not because Drew is too feminine. Every time Piper has an unkind thought towards a child of Aphrodite, it's because they're glaring at her or giving her judgmental looks, or generally treating her like a pariah for being different from them, not because they're like wearing pink. I also don't agree with the reading of Piper disliking shallow people as meaning feminine people. Piper is the child of a Hollywood actor and has gone to school with the children of the rich and famous. If you talk to people who've gone to schools like that, it's a very common complaint that kids in those schools tend to be very judgmental about superficial things. They judge and mock you for what kind of clothes and shoes you wear, what kind of car you drive, if you get your nails done often enough, and so on. The problem here isn't femininity, but the shallow materialism involved in placing a very high value on superficial things. This is what Piper means when she says that Aphrodite isn't just about looking good, but about actually doing good, about the good love can do in the world. Piper clearly does not place value in looking good, and I think it makes perfect sense for her to dislike people who put so much stock in it that they become judgmental of people, like Drew does. I also think it's kind of weird to assume that just because Piper doesn't personally like dresses, that means she thinks she's better than anyone who does. Nothing in the text indicates that. The thing that makes Piper gag and make the quip about supermodels is not the pinkness of the cabin, but the smell of the perfume, strong enough to be smelled from the front porch. If you've ever been in the room when someone sprayed too much perfume, you know that gagging is a fairly understandable reaction. Once Piper actually moves into the cabin, she quickly recognizes that most, if not all of her half-siblings are living in fear of Drew's dictatorial rule over them and are being forced to be rude to her. She comes to actually like some of them, despite not sharing most of their interests, and definitely empathizes with them, because she knows exactly how it feels to be bullied, and she doesn't like seeing them treated that way. And her half-siblings come to respect and accept her in return. It's pretty clear to me that Piper was mainly averse to Drew's objectively shallow and petty nature, averse to anybody who judges people based on their hair or their clothes rather than who they are as a person. She's not averse to Drew for simply being femme. Piper also clearly has no problem getting along with other girls, as she becomes friendly with Annabeth and Rachel very quickly, and eventually Hazel as well. She even becomes friends with Raina by the end of the series. In fact, her first impulse upon meeting Raina is to admire her. So I don't think she's harboring internalized misogynistic feelings, and I don't think this accusation has any merit in the text. I think this criticism is basically just projection. For some people, Piper reminded them of themselves or someone they knew who thought that they were better than other girls. And so they've assigned a personality to her that is not reflected in the text. And anytime Rick wrote her doing anything other than their projected idea of her, they rejected it and said, "Oh wow, the author and creator of this character is trying to make her a good person, but she's really not because I decided she wasn't." If you already dislike someone, everything they do easily looks pernicious, even if it isn't, which means no amount of evidence will ever really convince you. Number 4. She's too obsessed with her boyfriend. I find this claim the most baffling of all of them, mainly because everyone seems to take it as gospel truth that Piper is too obsessed with Jason, to the point that he's the only thing she cares about and is willing to throw everyone else under the bus to protect him. I understand where this idea got started, I just think it's unhinged. And for this one, I'm going to go about it differently. Instead of showing you the alleged evidence for this claim and then refuting it, I'm going to start out with some evidence that it isn't true, and then address the criticisms afterwards. So for those of you who read these books and are yet not aware, somehow, here is the basic plot of The Lost Hero. Piper, Jason, and Leo are picked up in Nevada and taken to Camp Half-Blood. They are then sent on a quest to free Hera from captivity and prevent the rise of Porphyrion. But Piper has been receiving dream visions from the giant Enceladus, telling her that he has her father captive, and that he will kill him unless Piper diverts the path of the quest to him, allowing Jason and Leo to be killed. If she obeys him, he'll let her father go. She spends most of the book fully intending to get the boys killed to save her dad, but she eventually confesses the situation to Jason and Leo, and they work out a plan with the hunters to delay the rise of Porphyrion so that they can go into this literal Jason-Leo trap to try and save her father. But this is a risk that Jason and Leo agree to take to help Piper, and in the end they all survive and manage to save the day. Hooray! Woo! Yeah! So, to recap, she actively risks Jason's life to try and save her father. That's the book. That's the whole book! So why do people think this accusation is true? If you agree with this criticism, you're probably thinking of a scene in Mark of Athena, where Piper, Jason, and Percy are in Kansas talking to Bacchus, when the boys are suddenly possessed by eidolons and start trying to kill each other. The possessing spirits then demand that she choose one to die, or else they'll force the two to fight until one of them ends up dead anyway. Piper internally thinks that she'd like to attack Percy to try and save Jason's life, because she sees that Percy is winning the fight. She was shouting in sheer desperation. Percy raised his sword over Jason's chest. Panic closed up Piper's throat. She wanted to attack Percy with her dagger, but she knew that wouldn't help. Whatever was controlling him had all of Percy's skill. There was no way she could beat him in combat. Now, considering the fact that Piper is dating Jason and has spent the last 6 months getting to know him, while Percy is some guy she's known for maybe 36 hours, this is kind of an understandable thought to have in the heat of the moment. Especially since she doesn't actually choose Percy to die, nor does she try and kill him herself. She knocks them both unconscious and then brings them both to safety. This is just an internal thought, a fleeting moment of pure emotion without rationality that she masters quickly. And I think we could compare this quite fairly to something Percy thinks later in this same book. When Annabeth is getting ready to go on her solo quest, Percy doesn't want her to because he won't be able to go with her. She had to go on this quest. The fate of the world might depend on it. But part of him wanted to say, "Forget the world." He didn't want to be without her. Could we read this as Percy literally being willing to murder all life on the planet to stay with Annabeth? I mean, technically yes, if we wanted to be hyper-literal and very uncharitable. But would it be fair to read it that way? No, because a person's innermost thoughts are not what define them. Their actions do. Percy does let Annabeth go off on her solo quest, and Piper never actually sacrifices the safety of anybody else just to protect Jason. Quite the opposite. But for some reason, over and over again, people want to hold Piper accountable for her innermost thoughts and feelings, when no other character is held to that standard, and regardless of what her actions actually are. The most popular version of this criticism says that Piper thinks about Jason too much in her internal monologue. But I've read these books many times, and that didn't reflect with my memory of her narration. But to make sure,
I actually went through and counted every time she thought about Jason romantically in The Lost Hero, where Piper narrates more of the story than in any other book. I didn't count all of the normal mentions of Jason, like when she describes his actions or facial expressions or worries about his general survival, because that would be similar to how Leo thinks about Jason in his chapters. I counted sentences that come in succession as one thought rather than each individual sentence. So like if she considered her romantic feelings in a few sentences in one paragraph or two paragraphs, one after the other. That's one continuous thought. So this book has around 580 pages, or 56 chapters, and Piper narrates 18 of them. I counted her thinking about Jason 15 times. 17 if you count the 2 times she thinks she should be happy about Jason doing some romantic thing, but she can't because she's too worried about the quest. Several of the thoughts were twice in the same chapter. So that means there are at least 7 chapters where she doesn't think about Jason at all. And considering the fact that Piper is a teenage girl, thinking about the person you've got a crush on this amount isn't crazy, and it certainly doesn't constitute a hyperfixation.
Especially when you consider that Annabeth thinks about Percy in a longing or romantic way at least 8 times in the first 4 chapters of Mark of Athena. And I hear you cry, "But the circumstances!" And to that I say, consider Piper's brainwashed false memory circumstances. And in spite of all of that, Piper spends most of her narration thinking about her dad, even while trying to parse through her feelings for a boyfriend who doesn't remember her. What this criticism really boils down to is that Piper is a generally disliked character who has romantic feelings for another, somewhat disliked character. So their love is interpreted as annoying and obsessive if the reader doesn't care about them. But when Annabeth and Percy act obsessive or clingy, everyone loves it. When Annabeth spent 2 days straight searching for Percy without sleeping, nobody said she was being too obsessed with her boyfriend. When she spent 6 months doing literally nothing except searching for Percy, nobody said she was too obsessed with her boyfriend. When she threw out all thoughts of diplomacy and negotiation after arriving in New Rome to make out with Percy in front of everyone, nobody said she was too obsessed with her boyfriend. But when Piper has fleeting thoughts about wanting to save Jason over Percy 2 times, thoughts that she feels intense guilt over, well, she's way too obsessed with her boyfriend. And I'm not saying that Annabeth is obsessive. I'm just pointing out the fact that the fandom is very willing to approach her emotions with nuance and empathy, while they're eager to villainize Piper for hers. There is yet another angle to this argument which goes, okay, maybe she isn't obsessed with him, but she's way too possessive of Jason. Sometimes people will point to quotes like this as evidence. Usually Piper didn't like it when other girls checked out her boyfriend, but Annabeth didn't seem to care that he was good-looking. She studied him more like he was a complicated blueprint. But there's no indication that she would have actually done anything about it if Annabeth had been checking Jason out. This is just her relaying her feelings again. And I can totally relate to this feeling. A few years back, a cashier at my local corner store really had the hots for my husband back when we were still dating. He would even actively flirt with him while I was standing there holding his hand. And I really didn't like it, but I also never did anything about it. I don't think the fact that these interactions made me upset meant that I was possessive of my partner. I think it's pretty normal to be upset when people try it on with your partner and disrespect your relationship in that way. And as long as you don't lash out because of it, I see no problem with it. There was also this time where Piper told Drew, that girl who's been bullying her since the moment they met, to stay away from Jason. "In case you think I'm not a true daughter of Aphrodite," Piper said, "don't even look at Jason, Grace. He may not know it yet, but he's mine. If you even try to make a move, I will load you into a catapult and shoot you across Long Island Sound." Now, in context, this happens during Piper's challenging of Drew to a duel. So she's clearly trying to intimidate Drew, which is generally understood as pretty much the only way to deal with a bully. But Piper is also known to get defensive whenever someone flirts with Jason. I think we should acknowledge that this is another double standard, because if Piper is too possessive because of this stuff, then Annabeth should be considered extremely possessive of Percy. In the original pentology, Percy has two love interests, Annabeth and Rachel. At the end of that series, Rachel becomes the Oracle of Delphi, and as part of that must swear off romantic relationships, so this ship is dead in the water. But for a while there, Rachel was public enemy number one in the eyes of the fandom, and also in the eyes of Annabeth. In the Battle of the Labyrinth, Percy realizes that the only way they'll be able to navigate said labyrinth is by getting help from Rachel, who can see through the mist to guide them. Annabeth is super jealous of Rachel, despite the fact that at this point she and Percy aren't dating, and never confessed their feelings for each other. She kissed him once, but only because she thought he was going to die, and she never outright confessed her feelings. And yet the idea that Percy and Rachel might have feelings for each other causes Annabeth to be actively rude to Rachel for over a year. It wasn't until after Rachel became the Oracle that Annabeth fully stopped being mean to her. And yet you never really see anyone accuse Annabeth of being too possessive of Percy, because the general opinion is that Percy does, in fact, belong to Annabeth, and anyone who says otherwise should be guillotined. So it's fine for Annabeth to be possessive of Percy, but it's not okay for Piper to be possessive over her relationship with Jason? Make it make sense! It doesn't make sense! But what it does do is lead us very neatly into the next complaint. Number 5. She's not attracted to or impressed by Percy Jackson. This one is dumb. It's just dumb. I can't even try with this one. I'm sorry. In the Mark of Athena, Piper gets a good look at Percy for the first time, and here's what happens. Piper hadn't studied him up close before. After hearing so much at Camp Half-Blood about Percy Jackson this and Percy Jackson that, she thought he looked, well, unimpressive, especially next to Jason. Percy was more slender, about an inch shorter, with slightly longer, much darker hair. He wasn't really Piper's type. If she'd seen him in the mall somewhere, she probably would have thought he was a skater. Cute in a scruffy way, a little on the wild side, definitely a troublemaker. She would have steered clear. Basically the problem here is that the fandom is in love with Percy because he is the perfect golden boy who can do no wrong. So the fact that Piper is not impressed by him to some feels like Piper has punched their grandma in the face. It's also worth noting that Piper is one of the only named female characters in the franchise to have a direct conversation with Percy and not at least flirt with him, let alone fall for him. The only other I can think of off the top of my head is Clarice, and she's a bully that we're supposed to hate, at least at first. Paradoxically, any female characters who express romantic interest in Percy are hated by the fandom for attempting to mess with Persibeth. Bringing up Rachel again, these days she's kind of considered benign as a character, but back in the late aughts, the hatred for Rachel was really extreme, and I remember participating in the hate when I was 13 and I didn't know any better. Now that Perchel is dead, everyone looks back on their hatred of Rachel with a lot more skepticism, and people have realized that she really didn't deserve all the hate that she got. But that realization took over a decade, and a complete removal of Rachel as a romantic rival for Percy's affections, and a similar thing had to happen with Calypso. So if girls who are romantically interested in Percy are bad, and girls not romantically interested in Percy are also bad, that means the only girl characters we're allowed to like are Annabeth, and I guess Hazel because she said Percy was good looking that one time, and Raina because she tried to date Percy, but respectfully bowed out once she learned about Annabeth and deferred to her absolute, total, and complete possession of Percy. Wait a minute. Number 6. Piper doesn't deserve to be considered one of the most powerful demigods. So I kind of touched upon this earlier in the Aphrodite section, but basically the issue here is that Piper is not really a fighter, or at least combat-adjacent things are not her special skill. Percy and Jason are both great swordsmen and have strong elemental magic. Frank is a great archer and tactician, as well as a shapeshifter. Leo is a weapons engineer and has fire magic. Hazel is a cavalry fighter and sorceress, and Annabeth is a skilled strategarian, as well as having a broad scope of general knowledge and some fighting skills. And then there's Piper, with her charm speak and good looks. Oh, and her magical ability to speak French. So I see how, on the surface, you could think that Piper has no real importance. However,
I think the point is more that Piper is the correct demigod for this team. A kind of symbiotic relationship in which the personalities and abilities of the seven meld into a highly productive and supportive grouping. This is not just about being physically or magically strongest. There are 7 of them because they need to work together to accomplish their goals, and each have abilities that the others lack. But there are many points across the series where Piper saves the lives of the others single-handedly, points where she saves the entire quest from failure, and points where she saves the day by working with the others. She saves Jason and Leo from killing each other in Medea's department store in The Lost Hero. In the Mark of Athena, she prevents any crew members from being possessed again by Eidolons, saves Jason from being drowned to death by Achelous, and saves Jason and Percy again from being drowned in the Nymphaeum. In House of Hades, when their ship is boarded by the Boreads and Chion, she single-handedly saves them all using her charm speak and clever thinking. Then, in Blood of Olympus, only she was able to get an ingredient for the physician's cure, thereby saving Leo, and she prevents key crops from turning them into the giants. And in the final showdown with Gia, her charm speak is what enables Leo's plan to succeed.
Over and over again, the 7 found themselves in situations where the only thing that could save them was Piper. And I've actually seen people try to make the argument that it was too forced, and that Rick just wrote a bunch of unrealistic situations for Piper to shine in. And I find this take hilarious because, yeah, that's literally what being a writer is. You invent a scenario for your protagonist to succeed in. Annabeth's whole solo quest is the same thing. He could have written a situation she couldn't overcome, but that was not the point. This entire story is a completely made-up scenario for characters to make the right moves in. And that's equally true for Piper as it is for Percy. I mean, Percy fought the literal god of war at age 12. And beat him! But Piper saving the day is too unrealistic for you guys? That's where we draw the line! If you've decided that Piper is useless, you're going to reject any evidence that contradicts that as unrealistic. But that's just your perception. It's not a fact of her character. Your unwillingness to see the power of her character doesn't mean it isn't there. Final thoughts. I know there are some people who claim they dislike Piper because she wasn't given enough development as a character, but it seems like most of these people never bothered to actually read Piper's chapters in good faith. It's actually kind of heartbreaking to me because people have interpreted their lack of interest in her as a lack of development, when there was plenty of development in the text that they just ignored or rejected. I think there are a lot of double standards when it comes to Piper, where things she thinks or does are villainized when similar actions in Percy, in Annabeth, or any other character are accepted. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this happens to be the first real female voice in this series, because our perfect and beloved Annabeth was only portrayed through the eyes of Percy for the first 5 books, meaning the reader never had to be confronted with Annabeth's actual thoughts and feelings. Fans will often use their love for Annabeth as proof that their dislike of Piper is not at all rooted in misogyny, but I think the reality might be a little more complicated. There's this idea in activist and academic circles called respectability politics. Basically what it means is when members of a minority or oppressed group are blamed for their own oppression because they don't adequately avoid qualities and stereotypes associated with their group. For example, a black woman who uses slang and has cornrows, who gets upset in public, being verbally abused with a racial slur, and then being told, well, if you didn't act like that, people wouldn't be so racist to you. There's a version of it for women called acceptable womanhood. In the past, a woman who transgressed outside of her socially acceptable role might face ridicule or even assault and be labeled as easy or mannish by her community, because transgressive women deserve whatever they get, according to this line of thinking. A common way this manifests today is how if, for example, a woman decides to have children, she'll usually be passed over for promotions at work or even fired. And if she complains, people will say, well, what did you expect? If you wanted to be treated equally to a man, then you shouldn't have become a mother, because mothers belong at home with the kids, not in the workplace. But I think there's another type of acceptable womanhood from within feminism, and I've been noticing it more since I got married. This version features the idea that a woman cannot be truly feminist if she wants a romantic relationship with a man. A female character isn't really empowered if she has a boyfriend or a husband, even if that partner respects her, because she's still depending on a man or caring about a man's feelings. She becomes not really feminist, or not as feminist as some other character. And once this label of not truly feminist is placed on a famous woman or a fictional character, suddenly it becomes acceptable to talk in quite misogynistic ways about them, or to make comparisons between them and other women, fictional or not, as if all women should be exactly the same. Oh, she's so obsessed with being the center of attention. She's useless. She's not even that strong or independent. She's so grating and annoying. She's so whiny and weepy, etc. I've noticed how some feminists really hate it when a single female character gets into a heterosexual relationship because they feel like this removes agency from the character, or that it's just cliché. And I don't understand that. Like, am I less of a feminist because I fell in love with and married a man? Am I less of an individual because I care about my husband's feelings? Obviously not. So why is a character less feminist if she's in love with a man, if she has romantic feelings, if she wants to get married and have kids? Why is she less feminist for depending on a man who equally depends upon her? I know that issues of representation are at play here. Women are often defined in media by their relationships with men, and a lot of fictional women exist solely to complement a male character's arc, which is definitely a problem. I'm just a little exhausted of the feminism Olympics, in which we must rally behind the most feminist characters and criticize the less feminist ones. Feminism in the real world is about equality. It's about breaking the shackles of gender expectations and replacing them with personal freedom. It's about empowering women to make choices for themselves, and some women are going to have romantic feelings and want to get married. Statistically, most of us do, even in the Western world. Demeaning Piper McLean because you think she's less empowered because of her lack of combat skills and her longing romantic feelings is a manifestation of acceptable womanhood, in my view. You've determined what a female character should be like, and then discounted anyone that doesn't fit the mold as useless. And in a series chock full of young women who are physically strong, capable in combat, not interested in romance and marriage, virulently objecting to one character who is the opposite seems really silly. I mean, we have the Hunters of Artemis and the Amazons in this universe. Personally, I don't want a story in which all of the girls are copies of Annabeth, Thalia, and Reyna, because that's not realistic. And if you need a female character to be a hardened warrior in order to appreciate them, then maybe your perspective is informed more by misogyny than you think it is. By way of conclusion, I want to give a brief explanation as to what I like about Piper McLean, because I do want to write a full essay on this topic at some point, but I've got to wrap this up somehow. I think this character actually has a lot going for her, and I found her pretty relatable when I first read the series. In many ways, I consider myself an academic sort of person. I really enjoy reading and learning. Heck, I wrote this entire essay for fun, so you might assume I'd relate to Annabeth. And while I do love Annabeth, I think that when I was a teenager, I was way more like Piper. Annabeth is who I wanted to be, but Piper is more like who I actually was. Her struggle isn't rooted in the fact that she isn't good enough or strong enough, but in her self-doubt. She worries that she really is as useless as everyone says. I felt the same way. There was a part of me that just refused to believe I had talent or beauty, a part that didn't know my own power, my own worth. I think if we're really honest with ourselves, most of us as teens were not these confident, strong, badass people like Annabeth. We were insecure and uncomfortable like Piper. We cared deeply, we felt things deeply. We struggled to make ourselves listened to or taken seriously because adults and peers didn't respect us. And if you just don't relate to Piper, then that's absolutely fine. You don't have to stand Piper, you don't have to favor her, you don't have to like her even. That is not my point. My point is that maybe the reason you don't relate to her isn't because she's inherently bad, unfeminist, weak, or undeveloped. Maybe you just don't relate to her because you just don't. It doesn't have to be deep. This is all subjective. But all of these complaints and all of the attacks on this character are really not warranted, and I think that it's telling that the one character that the most ire is directed at is the least violent, most insecure, most emotional, and arguably the most human demigod in the seven.